Hello, welcome to show 48 of The Shortlist. I'm Johnny Campbell, your host for the show, CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. And if you've been on any of the past 47 episodes of this show, you know our format. We're a live show. We broadcast every Wednesday at 4 p.m. UK Ireland time. We broadcast to YouTube and LinkedIn. So you may notice, just in case you're not listening to us live, that there is a live audience who often chime in with chats and comments. And if you're listening live, we very much welcome your comments. You can comment on the LinkedIn stream on my own profile on LinkedIn, or you can comment on the YouTube stream as well. And if you want to find out anything more about previous episodes or upcoming episodes, I encourage you to go to socialtalent.com/the shortlist, where you can find video copies. You can find links to our podcast. By the way, just in case you are watching this live and you want to try and recap, or you don't have time next week to join us, you can always listen to our podcast, which you can find by looking up The Shortlist on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. So what does show number 48 have in store for you? Well, today we're going to be talking about how talent strategy is being shaped in a post-COVID world. There's no doubt that if you're working in the talent acquisition or even the broader talent space, the end goal has always been the same. How do you find the best talent or the best people for the roles you're hiring for? But the complexities typically arise somewhere in the middle of the process. And the last year has seen trends change faster than I've ever seen it in my 20 odd years in this business. And companies are focusing and refocusing their shift, and also the demand for hiring, whether it's shutting down hiring all of a sudden, ramping up like crazy, shutting down again. We're seeing tons of ebbs and flows. COVID has been arguably the greatest disruptor or accelerator of change that I've seen in the last 20, 30 years. And whether that be the rise from work from anywhere, the increased amount of tech that's been put in to drive gig economy workers, tax compliance issues around workers working from different parts of the world, an increased focus on the more holistic, wider life of the employee. Unless you work for Basecamp, by the way, whom this week decided that they want to give a screw you to your personal life and only focus on work. That's a whole other topic we'll deal with a different day. Organizations, typically on scale especially, need to be more creative in thinking about what their strategy is. And I've seen a lot of organizations literally throw their talent strategy in the trash, in the bin in the last few months, realizing they need to reset and go again. And so to join us to kind of drive this discussion of how we shape talent strategy in a post-COVID world, I'm being joined by Dugald McIntosh. Dugald is somebody who I last shared a beer with in a villa in Sitges above Barcelona a couple of years ago. It seems like a million years ago since we could do that. And Dugald is now the managing partner of a company called TalentIn, which is a European consultancy firm that advises companies on talent management strategy. And Dugald tells me that they work with organizations kind of before they implement the stuff or change the process, and work with their executives to really think about that talent in an agnostic, product agnostic, vendor agnostic way to give the best solution. But Dugald, maybe you can tell us a bit more about your own background, what brought you to this today, and a little bit more about the services you provide before we get into today's topic.
Hey, Johnny, thank you very much for having me, and thanks for the intro. I'm actually currently working from anywhere as best I can. I'm down in Cornwall today. My home is Bristol. So unfortunately, I can't be in Barcelona, but this is as sunny as I can get. I guess my story, I worked for big resourcing outsource businesses my entire career, delivering things like MSPs, RPOs. And I guess I did my time with the Manpower Group, which is obviously one of the big staffing businesses globally, and then joined Capita, where I was working within their people solutions business. And I guess, I spent my entire career delivering outsource programs, helping organizations actually manage their either their perm recruitment or their contingent workers and their service-based workers. When I left Capita, I thought, how can I work slightly differently? I was seeing all the changes going on in the market. And ultimately, I decided to switch sides and directly help clients to design their strategy. And I guess try and, I felt that I'd got a lot of experience as a service provider. How can I help them avoid some of the mistakes that I've been making or have helped make as part of the industry for the last 15 years? And TalentIn, what we do, we don't have any ties to service providers or tech companies, and we'll support mostly companies headquartered across Europe. We're a European business, to figure out where they're at now, an operational assessment in terms of trying to understand their current landscape, try and figure out what they need to do, which is, becoming, is right now at the moment as organisations are trying to answer questions around their talent strategy, who their talent is, who's working for them and on their behalf, and then also to execute. So that's helping to select providers, helping to select technology, and helping them to really execute a change transformation program.
Well, I'm dying to get into the meat of today's topics, because there are many, Dugald, in terms of when you look at strategy and talent and what's changing in the last year alone. I think it's an exciting time. But before we get into that, I want to get stuck into some pretty big news related to that, and there's no shortage of it to be found related to talent strategy. But let's go with a couple of really juicy pieces that have taken our eye in the last week. Niall, let's go with some news. So first up, Dugald, I wanted to chat with you about the Deliveroo IPO. And no, I don't want your financial advice on whether I should buy shares or not, right? But I wanted to talk to you about the context of this CDAM article that was published last week by Phil Bloomer. And it talks about Deliveroo IPO, is the gig economy empire crumbling? And to give some background and context to those of you who haven't read the article, not familiar with Deliveroo's IPO, they IPO'd recently, a few weeks back. And since then, their stock market price has pretty much tumbled. And it's tumbling against a kind of backdrop of this pushback, particularly in Europe, where Deliveroo would be most active, as to what is a permanent employee or an employee of the organization and what's a contractor and their rights. And Deliveroo are really in the crosshairs of this. And the article CDAM is pretty one-sided in its view on this, in my opinion. It really looks at Deliveroo as an evil empire, exploiting workers, giving them absolutely no benefits. It implies almost slavery or slave-like conditions to their staff. What's your perspective on this particular example, Dugald, of the gig economy? And then perhaps what's your perspective on the wider gig economy?
Well, obviously the headline is clickbait a little bit there, Johnny, I think. On this specific example, I think it's really interesting because obviously Deliveroo went through an IPO just after the Uber High Court judgment in the UK. And ultimately, I think, that had a significant impact on their value, which is what this article is talking about. So for those of you that aren't aware, Uber have been fighting for 5 years the judgment as to whether their drivers are self-employed or not. Ultimately, I think this was the final appeal, and ultimately the answer came back that they were dependent workers and therefore classified as workers. It's worth also noting that there's no actual legal definition of gig workers, but I'll come on to that in a moment. Deliveroo engage their workers in a slightly different way, in that they have some personal choice, which means that they can accept or not accept shifts, and therefore they are continued to be classified, or Deliveroo classify them as self-employed. And ultimately, I think what happened here is that prior to the public release of the shares, ultimately the city weren't that enthusiastic about Deliveroo's buying Deliveroo shares, despite the fact that on the surface level they look like a perfect tech company to buy. Ultimately, because of the way that they engaged their workers. So fundamentally, the value of the company was significantly eroded by the way that they are engaging and defining the workers, that essentially, that's where they get their value from. And it's also probably worth, this is all technical stuff, but Deliveroo know that this is a continuing problem. They're very conscious of this fact. They put aside 35 million to potentially fight worker claims. So, they're deliberately positioning themselves and continuing to position themselves differently from Uber. And then the other thing I think that's worth noting is that a direct competitor of theirs, Just Eat, I think, very deliberately have a different strategy and have gone out there and say that they will be directly employing their workers. Now, the impact of that is that they will be more expensive, so they'll have a more expensive operating model. But their bet is that long term, that'll increase the value of their business over Deliveroo. And I think the other thing that they're also betting on is that it will help them to have tie-up relationships with partners in their marketplace. So things like, for example, supermarkets, who are obviously very important at the moment as everybody's been in lockdown. So there's kind of big strategic bets here in the marketplace. Deliveroo look like they might be on the wrong side of it if you look at their share price.
It's interesting that the share price bounced back yesterday on an announcement of one of those supermarket kind of tie-ins with Waitrose in the UK. And for those of you listening in the US, to give you some context, the Uber case in the UK is very similar to the Prop 22 case in California, and a similar ruling that kind of went, well, in the US and California, it went Uber's way, and the UK went all the way to the Supreme Court and didn't go in Uber's way. And obviously Uber's stance on these things has matured even since both of those rulings. And I think they're probably taking a more holistic approach and saying, okay, this isn't a one size fits all necessarily. And they've made some statements around that as well. Deliveroo example is interesting. I think, in the US, DoorDash and others will be similar types of organizations. It reminds me actually of in the US, the Uber Lyft comparison several years ago, under Uber's previous CEO, where I saw this explosion of Lyft, which isn't available in Europe. And I saw Lyft really blowing up in loads of states. And essentially, every driver typically had Lyft and Uber, right? But I saw people, particularly maybe in places like New York and California, use Lyft more than Uber from the ethical perspective. They felt, whatever the perception or if it was reality, I don't know, there was a feeling that Lyft were a better organization, treated their drivers better, were more ethical, and therefore, they voted with their phones and they used more Lyft, and Lyft grew massively during this period. So it's an interesting comparison to Just Eat and Deliveroo, because there was kind of a precedent for the other company growing off this, even if the price is the same or more expensive.
I think you're right, but we don't see Lyft outside of the US market, do we, Johnny? And so the Uber model allowed them to grow very quickly globally, whereas I think Lyft, would have been had difficulty doing that if they had an employment model.
But what about the wider perspective? You've been in the mixed contingent versus perm workforce environment. You've seen it in companies. This is something where it surprised me, when I got to know it more, how different some organizations treated their permanent staff versus their contractors. Very different benefits, very different approaches. Some of it driven by fear of legal treatments in Europe. Again, how you treat somebody could imply they're a different type of worker, which could cost the company a fortune. Post-pandemic, what is your forecast as to what direction this will go in? What do you think? Okay. Where do you think this will go eventually?
So how do I unpack this a little bit? So first off, I'd say there's a couple of so on a macro level, everybody expects flexible workers, if you like, freelance worker community to grow. Yeah. And I think I saw a report by a very big employer. I mean, they employ 350,000 workers globally, right? Okay. They reckon 20% of their workforce today are non-perm. They reckon it's going to be up to 50%. Okay. So that's the type of shift we're looking at, right? So number one, it's here to stay. Organizations expected to grow. And I think the other thing that I would say, and we saw it within the Taylor report, is that flexible working is people want it. Yeah, that's the other thing. People want to be able to have to work flexibly. But I think there's two tiers. There's a kind of a two-tier system here. You have your Deliveroo riders, Uber. I mean, it's probably too flippant to describe them as this, but ultimately there's a surplus of people that would potentially do that work, okay, and therefore it makes them vulnerable to, I guess, organisations taking advantage of them and ultimately paying them less than the minimum wage, and all the things that they would expect to get if they're a worker, yeah. And then you have the other tier, which I think. And obviously, because there's no real definition of a freelancer and a gig worker, okay, is your self-employed worker in the professional, highly skilled space, and they are they absolutely want to work in that way, and they're getting significant, not only I guess work benefits in terms of being able to work flexibly. But also economically, they're better off, by working in that way. So you've got two tiers, really, I think, Johnny, and it's going to be really interesting to see the impact, because you've got the organisations that want to use workers flexibly. You've got individuals that want to work flexibly, and then I think the other stakeholder in this, and potentially the most important one in the long term, is national governments, and what they want to do is they want to be able to. They're used to the biggest revenue that they get from a tax perspective is payroll taxes, and clearly, they're starting to see, as workers are increasingly working like this, is it impacting the tax return that they get, and so what they're trying to do is to do two things. I think number one is they're trying to figure out, how can I protect my tax return income? And that's why you're seeing things like IR35 in the UK, but other governments all over the world are changing their tax legislation in order to target freelance workers. But they're also thinking about their obligations in terms of enforcing worker rights, which is, again, what you're seeing with the Uber case. And they need to do that because, obviously, their citizens expect them to do it, right? And it's the citizens that vote for them. So it's all of these forces, if you like, coming together at the moment, that we're starting to see. And it's ultimately down to greater individual choice and organisations operating very differently in a way that the old structures hadn't anticipated and haven't adapted quickly enough in order to be able to cope with.
I'd love to hear from some of our live audience listening, your thoughts and comments on the gig economy, the split, whether it's US, European, or Asia, what's happening, what direction it will go in. So please do join us with your comments, and we'll read them out. But I want to move on, because Dugald, I could chat about this topic for quite some time, but I do want to try and cover a few more areas, because there's so much happening in talent strategy, gig economy being such a big one by itself. But let's park that for a second and go to our second news item. And you mentioned this, it's affecting you, it's affecting me right now, perhaps most of us listening. And this is from Business Insider, from Marguerite Ward, and publishing information on Spotify. And it's that Spotify have said it's letting employees work from anywhere while still paying San Francisco and New York salaries. And the article covers a bunch of other companies, Salesforce and other companies that have made recent announcement. Talk to me about work from anywhere, and maybe try and unpack the different implications, because there are many. The implications that you've seen to be the ones that organizations are most worried about, most anxious about.
I'll start with the Spotify headline there, because I thought that was a really interesting one. And when I read it, I couldn't believe it. San Francisco salaries, because we've all heard about San Francisco salaries, right? And it was interesting that a lot of organizations are obviously coming out there at the moment and saying their employees can work from anywhere. And I think two things I would say, but a lot of them aren't saying that they will pay them what they were paying them before when they lived it, and were having to pay, San Francisco housing prices, or London or Paris housing prices. So I think you'll see an impact on that. I think the other thing I would say is that, Spotify actually only have 6,500 employees, I think. Whereas, the greatest employers, still are, I think Walmart have 2.2 million employees. The NHS in the UK has almost 2 million employees. And, those guys can't work from anywhere. So we're really just talking about people that can work behind a computer. So that does, I guess, we talk about work from anywhere, but a lot of folks, I'm doing a house up at the moment, for example, and I can tell you can't hammer a nail in from anywhere. But I think, one of the things that I'm interested to figure out is not only are those organizations that are saying that their employees can work anywhere, I think they need to think about, and you hear it a lot, how do I continue to be creative? How do I continue to kind of have, particularly organizations that are creative, talk about the importance of kind of bringing teams together. How are they going to solve that problem? And then when you start to unpack that creativity, we're not just talking about the creative sector, engineering businesses, IT businesses, any businesses that are kind of trying to design solutions, which is generally most businesses, right? Okay, are creative. So how do you kind of continue to get that? The other thing I think that organizations, when they're thinking about working from anywhere, are grappling with is the folks that the new entrants to their business, particularly early careers. Yeah. You can't pull up that, we know the skills shortages out there and the importance and the need to train people and bring the new generation of talent in and train them. And I think, it's difficult to be able to do that. There's the other whole piece as well around, for some people, they don't have access to home offices, so there's a whole, making sure that it's inclusive. I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity to be more inclusive from working from anywhere by giving people access to jobs that they might not have been able to access before because they don't have to go to an office. And I think that's really important and an exciting opportunity. But then there's how are they going to be able to be productive in a potentially a home environment where there's lots of kids and noise, etc., etc. So there's lots of challenges thrown in there. But as a workforce wonk like me, the other thing that I struggle with is, again, I come back to this, taxes, right? Okay, governments want their payroll tax, and they're not going to have it. That suddenly, we've seen it, I think, at the start of COVID in the UK, where Barbados were advertising, come and work from Barbados, right? Yeah, if you're going to be locked in at home, get on a flight and come and do it from Barbados. You can be on the beach. And you can do that. And you could do that before COVID. And organizations were starting to try and get a handle on it. But where they kept having problems was where the tax got paid. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if they get on the wrong side of that, then they are the ones that their tax authorities will come after. It will be the hirer, ultimately, that will be expected to pay the tax, and the potential for fines and back pay, on taxes can be enormous. So you could end up finding, for example, that in that example that I just gave with Barbados expects the tax to be paid in Barbados. The UK expects the tax to be paid in the UK. And the worker thinks the tax isn't getting paid anywhere. And you can bet your bottom dollar that it will be, if it's a big organization, it will be the big organization that ends up being given the tax levy. Yeah. If it's and if it's a big global organization that has offices in Barbados and in the UK, they're going to be, that could be an expensive hangover.
There's a bunch of things you've touched on there I wanted to respond to. Spotify, yeah, you're right, smaller than the massive enterprises with maybe 6,000-7,000 employees. Interestingly, though, they are an organization, to the best of my knowledge, who apply benefits and opportunity across the board to their employees, regardless of whether they're full-time permanent staff or whether they're a contractor. They're more progressive. Maybe it's to be expected of a Swedish organization, the more Nordic progressive view on employment. They're not distinguishing. And I've seen many large companies, much bigger, who would make a very deliberate stance on, well, that person is a contractor. So they're not, for example, in our platform, they don't get a license. because they're a contractor, yet their colleague who's full-time get a license. And you're kind of like, well, don't you want to educate everybody and make them all better? Like, should it matter? And I was surprised. You talk about taxes and legal. I was told by a VP of TA many years ago, if I give that person a license, I have a tax implication that affects thousands of other workers. It's not about the person. I want to give them help, but this is not set up for me to do right by this person. And I have to be cognizant of that and bear in mind my company's perspective. So there's that. I think the comment about creativity, I dismiss. I think the idea that creativity can't be achieved through work from anywhere, and maybe you aren't suggesting that, it's been said by others, is nonsense. I think it's harder and we're just not used to it, but absolutely can be done. The onboarding piece is a challenge. We're actually running an event in May 20th. It's a free event. If anyone wants to register for it, it's online. You can work from anywhere and learn from anywhere. Social Talent Live, it's our third event like this on onboarding. And you can register at socialtalent.com/live. But essentially we're bringing a bunch of companies together to talk about onboarding, particularly in this virtual environment. We've got Procore in the US, Booking.com in the Netherlands. We've got IBM from a global perspective, Celonis out of Germany in the US, talking about how they've transitioned to, in IBM's case, onboarding 20,000 plus people, and how they've made that a really brilliant experience. It's amazing what can be done in this work from anywhere environment. But you are right, all the benefits, like that article as well pointed to the benefit of being able to hire talent anywhere as being one of the reasons to do this. People do forget you have to have a legal entity in the country you're hiring them in. You have to employ them directly there or go through some sort of contracting position where they are based. In Ireland, I know it's more than 6 months of the year. You're living here, you're domiciled here, you're registered, you have to pay tax here, and all sorts of rules like that. And the EU have common agreements across different countries in many different jurisdictions, as does everybody. It isn't so simple, but there is probably an idea in lots of people's heads that I can now hire any country in the world and pay them that low salary. That's not really how it works, to your point, I think, Dugald.
It isn't, and it does connect to the previous conversation we're having about gig workers, Johnny. Because a lot of that, and we're seeing platform companies, we're big rise in. It's been very popular in the US. Platform companies connecting often IT workers or workers in the creative industries, copywriters, etc. They don't take any employment responsibility. They're just, making a connection, and the workers will be freelance. And often they can be anywhere, right? Okay. And but again, the tax implications of that can be a real minefield for organizations. They need to really make sure they're on top of that before they jump.
I love your point about, and I hadn't really thought about this, shame on me. I always thought there was two parties. There's the employer and the employee, or the contractor or gig worker. But actually there's three. There's governments, the employer, and the person. And sometimes we think, the government are just being on the side of the gig worker. The government have a very separate agenda in this. And it's a really good point around protecting tax. Now, it's for the welfare of everyone who lives in their country, or should be. But it is a really good point. There is a separate agenda there. And too often, I guess, the government comes in and suggests that they are representing the interests of either employers or employees, when in fact they're representing their own interests. And it's important to recognize that can happen, I think.
It's a tricky one because they kind of got dual interests, haven't they, Johnny? Because they want inward investment, and in order to be able to kind of encourage inward investment, they want to have a flexible labour market, potentially, look, you're in Ireland, right? Low corporate taxes, and then at the same time, they have responsibility to their citizens, and they've got to generate tax income to pay for benefits, and they've got to have worker rights. So, like everything, they're walking a tightrope. And I think the other thing I was thinking about a little bit, because you start to see, you've got the Biden plan, haven't you, with his tax plan, whether that happens or not, it'd be interesting. But, I think what he's trying to do is to say, big international businesses should pay, tax where the revenue has been generated, right? Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see whether we start to see, similarly, whether it's in the EU or elsewhere, OECD, starting to come up with kind of global policies, if you like, around freelance workers, who can, particularly if they're connected through technology, work from anywhere.
Yeah, I think there's nothing new in some of that stuff, and I'll drop the subject now in a second on tax, because neither of us were probably self-proclaimed tax experts. But I used to live on a Caribbean island, and we had no employment tax. But we had consumption tax, very high consumption tax. In Ireland, I now live, we have a consumption tax called VAT, as you do, and we have an income tax. We both. So there's lots of models for trying to tax consumption or spending, but also to tax employment, and all sorts of variants in the middle. But I want to jump off into maybe some other topics that are affecting talent strategy at the moment. Dugald, get your thoughts. And just to throw a few at you, topics that I've seen that have come up in the last year, topics like internal mobility, areas of technology and investment, the automation of different parts of the process and the acceleration of that, digitization of processes like interviewing, assessment, onboarding. What are you seeing in that kind of tech space, and what are you seeing in maybe some of the process space like internal mobility, which maybe typically didn't live in the talent acquisition world and now is beginning to live in the talent acquisition world more, for example? What else are you seeing that's interesting coming out of the last year that's driving different changes in talent strategy?
Hey, well, this stuff's been on EPO, isn't it, Johnny? It's gone absolutely crazy, and that's from necessity. So there's a bunch of stuff there. Internal mobility, I think what's that been necessity? I mean, first of all, organizations are kind of probably trying to put a hold on their, additional new recruitment, right? Okay. So therefore, that's forced them, and also a lot of pressure not to let workers go, which I think has been, one of the big successful outcomes. Organizations, unlike the recession after the financial crash, kept onto workers as best they can. And they've also, but they've got much better at trying to figure out who their workers are, what their workers can do, and, moving them around the organization. And I think you've seen some organizations do that really well. And I think the technology has matured to a point where they can, and they can do it much better. Yeah. And you're seeing some really good products out there which enable that. And I think I would connect that to learning as well. I think that's the other big buzzword. Again, something we were talking about pre-COVID, but something that's really starting to happen now, giving workers access to learning, which allows them to be more productive and effective. And I think that's, I guess, two things. Number one is it's obviously driven from necessity. Yeah. Can't hire new workers, need to change, require different skills. But also we were seeing this pre-COVID, skills shortages. Yeah. And ultimately the way that you solve for that is by training people. We knew before that the skills cycle was getting shorter and shorter. So we had to retrain people. And again, now people are actually doing it. And obviously, digital tools are enabling it so much better. So really good opportunity for organizations if they're embracing it, I would say.
I spoke to a friend of mine this morning, and we were talking about another shift that he brought up, which is kind of moving away from the more traditional industrial model of having great products or, efficient factories or machines, into more, whether it's, more knowledge businesses or more services businesses, which refocus the organization on people as a strength. So the command control view of people, which was make them do their jobs of the past, and some companies still doing that, has quickly been replaced with this view of, who are our talent? Do we have the best talent? Are we giving them the best opportunities? Are we going to retain the best people? How can we develop the future leaders? All these themes, from old industrial companies who are changing their mindsets to this, to the new startups who have taken this approach from day one. There does seem to be a much, this time around, much more of a focus on talent is the strength of the business. It isn't the factories, the products, the engineering resources, the patents. It's the people we have. Is that a big thing that you're seeing accelerated?
Look, I'd say again, it's two stream, Johnny. A bit like the gig workers. Some of them don't get a choice, and there are, continuing to have to kind of work in a certain way. Others where they have a choice, because they have special skills and lots of, and there's a competition for them to come and work for you. There we're suddenly talking much more about the experience they have as individuals. Organizations have to be serious about their purpose, in order to be able to attract them. Again, we were talking about this a few years ago, but this is absolutely, and it has to be, it's more than just, words. I think if you want the people to, and again, I think the other thing I would say, what I think is interesting is that reality, you shouldn't just be thinking about applying it to your perm workers, right? Okay, your EVP, if you like. Why should people work for you? Giving them a great experience, giving them a great journey, continuing to kind of train them and develop them so that they kind of, increasing their value both personally and for your business. All those things, HR teams have been talking about and are getting good at. I would say that logic should also be applied to your non-perm workers as well. If you think about the fact that, increasingly the people that are working on your behalf, increasing the value of your business, getting your projects delivered, not going to be your employees. They might be freelancers. They might be provided to you by service companies. You need to think about your talent. There's everybody that's working on your behalf. And your EVP, if you like, is your employees, your freelancers, your service providers, all of those, that community. You want them. The winners will be the ones that can attract them to come and work for them, if you like, would be my bet. The ones that get it right, we're going to see their view, talent view is much broader.
Yeah, that brings me to kind of another big, huge theme that came out of COVID, not because of COVID, but just coincidentally, which was the diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of the momentum behind that as a theme in the corporate world. And I guess the one that gets the most attention because it's probably the most visible is diversity, but equity and inclusion, if you look at them as big topics, when you have a workforce made up of people with different contracts, different rights, it's really hard to be equitable. It's really hard to be inclusive if you see them as different. And do you think that in the wake of last summer's big movement, initially driven out of the US, but ended up being global, do you think that renewed focus on equity and inclusion will also perhaps prompt organizations to look differently on their talent, the classifications, the rights of those talent? Back to your point around maybe Just Eat kind of saying we're going to be more equitable, and we think equitable work practices will drive better business outcomes. Do you think that has been an accelerant as well, that DEI movement that started in the summer 20 to drive some more of this thinking around total talent?
Well, you'd like to think so, wouldn't you? And the opportunities there, it needs to be taken, and executed rather than it just being a kind of an aspiration. And I think, but I would say, I think women have been, more significantly impacted in the workforce than men. Through COVID, I think the evidence there to suggest that. I would suggest that again, particular socioeconomic groups have probably been more adversely affected. So there's a lot to go at, I think, in order to really, really make a meaningful impact that impacts people's lives. But the opportunity, absolutely, we come back to that point, the way that people connect much better. There is nowhere to hide any longer because we're all connected through technology. There's an absolute, but, recently I think I saw in the UK, the government rejecting the idea of having a bit like, I think that, companies in the UK have to publish in their annual reports the pay gap, the gender pay gap. There was a similar debate as to whether they should do that for ethnic groups in the UK, different ethnic groups, and they rejected it. So I think there's, I need to see evidence of, and if you look at the boardrooms, we're still seeing, not enough diversity. Johnny. So we need to see more evidence of it, more work.
I spoke with a friend of mine who runs talent for a very large organization, and he surprised me when he was sharing with me that their organization's focus is not on ethnicity or gender. They focus as their primary goal on your socioeconomic background, because they've seen that that is the biggest driver to fix the other issues that people typically focus first on. And that there's such a large correlation between, different ethnicities, genders, backgrounds that are marginalized. And actually the commonality is typically socioeconomic. And if you address the lack of socioeconomic access and ignore gender and ignore race, you actually end up fixing a lot of those things. Is that, I think it ties into your original comment about the two streams of gig workers. There's the gig worker who earns $200 or pounds an hour, and there's the gig worker who earns £10 or $10 an hour. It kind of doesn't matter whether you're black, white, whatever your color or race or creed is. It kind of the difference is one person earns $10, the other person earns $200. That's the biggest difference. That's holding the back.
It absolutely keeps coming back to that, doesn't it? Poverty. I think that when I worked one of the previous organisation I worked with, I was very proud of one thing the CEO said at the time, and I was quite impressed. He said anybody in this, he was very, put a lot of investments into economic, socio mobility, right, giving opportunity to kids that wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity. And one of the things he said, I remember at one of our big leadership conferences, he said, if I see anybody giving an unpaid internship, to, in this organization employs 60,000 people in the UK, then, as far as I'm concerned, they shouldn't be in this organization, right? Okay, I won't say they should be fired because I'm from the background, but you get my logic, right? Okay, he was very, and it's a big, we all have a big opportunity to make sure that we're giving opportunity. It's this white privilege thing, right? Okay, to people that wouldn't necessarily get it. And we also have and I think the other thing that I've kind of really hit home to me for the whole, Black Lives Matter debates is the fact that it's very difficult for me, from my background, to really understand, the challenges that some people have had to go through, in order to be able to get to work, to be able to get to education, to be able to access these things, and so I think, again, we just need to really, we need to work harder, I think, would be my scorecard.
You make a great point about the payment of interns. I know back in the day, we used to, very early days of social talent 10 years ago, we would have individuals working for us as interns, and we didn't pay them well at this, the first few years. We didn't have any money, we didn't pay them well. And we do now have a policy of paying interns an equivalent salary that you'd pay, an experienced graduate, at least coming into the workforce at a kind of first year level. That the person is putting their time in, they need an income, they shouldn't be disadvantaged. And it's an excellent point. I've seen some of the best movements on social mobility change the talent strategy. Like, don't just look at, are you looking at the right colleges, the white colleges, the black colleges? Like, hang on a second, can we hire someone who doesn't go to college, who didn't finish their GCSEs or whatever it might be, because maybe they could do the job, and maybe we just don't need a degree. And this idea of, is it the right college, or look at different colleges? Hang on a second, just look at someone who has, let's have a competency test, let's have a skills test. If they have the skills, who cares how they got to the point where they could actually apply that skill, if they have the potential? And again, a movement I'm seeing is a massive movement towards that hiring for potential and not hiring just for skills and experience, which I think is a very positive thing and will hopefully help that social mobility piece. So I think there are some of the more aspirational and heartwarming kind of things that have come out of the last year that I'd hope will continue.
Hey, haven't we all got a lot more connected to our communities, a lot more understanding in terms of our, our own personal responsibility, and I think that's been a real positive through the last, it's well over a year now, isn't it? I think that, the realization, I remember beforehand, we were very caught up in, achieving our business goals, our targets, et cetera. Now I think that's, we understand that we're all interconnected, aren't we, as humans? And that, I think that that I hopefully, as we move out of COVID, that will be a memory, that that we all will kind of take forward and grow from, I think. And certainly you're seeing a lot of intent at the moment, aren't you? Of organisations recognising that and recognising that, in order to be able to do well, in order to be able to attract the right staff, in order to be able to keep the right staff, in order to be able to get customers at the end of the day, then all of that needs to be a key, a really intrinsic part of how they do things.
It reminds me of something that's on the wall.
Do the right thing.
Behind me, which is, to read from that, you can do nothing, you can do something. When you're thinking about your talent strategy, do the right thing. Dugald, we're at time, and I really appreciate you sharing some insights with us today on the show. But we are at the point where I'd love you to share one last insight, one tip, if you'd like, to add to our shortlist, which could be something that you have been given or passed on to you in your career, or something that you just have gleaned yourself from your experience. But I'm going to invite you to share that tip for our shortlist with our audience, if you don't mind.
Well, I was thinking about this, Johnny, and I think, do the right thing is definitely something I've tried to live by. And I was trying to come up with something. I didn't realize you're going to have it on your poster, so I'm glad it wasn't. I'm not going to use that. But I think the way I'm going to articulate it is I remember years ago, in the early days of my career, I was working with a Danish guy, actually, and he, a very clever guy, and he leaned over and we were working on a problem together. And he said to me, he said, "It's very cold in Denmark." He said, "We have an expression." So it's a bit like wetting your pants on a cold day. It might feel good at the time, but pretty soon you realize it's a bad idea. And I think it's a good test for when you're making a decision. Are you doing this for the right reasons? And are you going to be pleased you did it in the long term?
So I love that. We're finishing with "Don't Wet Your Pants" from Dugald McIntosh.
On a cold day, Johnny.
on any day. Let's just say on any day. I don't care if it's a warm day.
The feeling.
Dugald, thanks so much for joining. Pleasure to have you. We'll have you on again. And I do wish you the very best with the business as well. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to reach out to you to find out more about your business and services, Dugald?
Hey, well, you'll see my mugshot on our webpage, TalentIn, and you can connect to me there, or obviously LinkedIn. I'm a LinkedIn user, guys, so feel free to reach out.
That's TalentIn. Give them a shout. You won't find too many Dugalds out in the world. Dugald, thanks for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. I wish you well. Good luck with the renovations in Cornwall. And thanks to all of you for listening today, for joining the show live if you joined us, or for listening to the podcast back. Love to get your thoughts and opinions as we move into show 49. I did mention, by the way, before I tell you about next week's show, we are going to be running our third Social Talent Live event next month. And it's on that topic of onboarding, particularly virtual onboarding, how to drive a more inclusive virtual onboarding process. We'll be joined by experts in Procore, Booking.com, Celonis, and IBM, and many others who will be sharing their insights, and some experts from our platform talking about the processes around onboarding, and particularly virtual onboarding. You can register for free. It's a free event, 2 hours long, with short, snappy debates, panels, and talks. And you can go to socialtalent.com/live to find out more about that. But don't forget to come back next week for show number 49 as we head towards the Magic 50. Joining me next week, I'm going to have Simon Mullins. Simon is somebody that you may not know unless you're in the world of executive search. If you're in the world of executive search, you will know Simon. Simon's an Englishman living in the US, currently based out of Washington State. And Simon is the man to talk to about executive recruiting around the world. Most of the world's biggest companies who do executive recruiting listen to Simon and work with his organization and their kind of group to share ideas, and no better person to have his finger on the pulse. But Simon's going to be joining me next week to talk about the evolution of executive recruiting. And I think we all still have this image of exec recruiters in their pinstripe suits doing high-level, C-level recruiting, but actually it's evolved. And it's moved on to be something that's more about, hard to find or key or critical talent. And he's going to share with us what he's learned from the group he works with as chief facilitator at ESIX. So that's going to be Wednesday, the 5th of May. That's 4 p.m. UK, Ireland time. You can tune in live on LinkedIn or YouTube, or you can catch it on your favorite podcast medium. That is Spotify, Apple, or wherever you find your podcasts. So don't forget, from today, when you think about today's talent strategies and what you're doing, and if you are in a position of influence, don't forget those magic 4 words. Do the right thing. We'll see you next week.